Hi everybody, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network, here once again for another Sunday session. We run these sessions every single Sunday at 5 p.m. The intention of these sessions is to, give you a little bit of insight into some of the issues and challenges that you're going to be dealing with in and around the property development sphere. It's not the replacement for education in any way, shape or form, but rather just giving you some insights into the process. That said, just waiting for a couple of people to come online. I can see Matt and Shelley have already joined, so welcome folks. But while I wait for a couple of others to come online, I'll just give you a little bit of insight as to some of the things that have been happening in and around Property Developer Network in the last little while. So just came back from Sydney yesterday, had a fantastic session there with our monthly meetups in Sydney, which we hold on the fourth Saturday of every month. Sorry, I lost track of times there. So the fourth Saturday of every month in Sydney, we had a gentleman by the name of Rich Harvey there talking about some of the major infrastructure projects that are being installed in and around Sydney that are pretty much enabling the city of the future as they amalgamate, three of the greater cities within Sydney and amalgamating them all into one giant metropolis. So also had Daichi, and apologies Daichi, I can't pronounce your surname, sharing a real deal there as well. Upcoming in the next little while, we've got our next event in Melbourne, which will be Mark Baker. He's going to be talking about, rent per room, rooming accommodation, boarding house, depending upon the terminology and the different state that you're from. He's going to be talking about those passive cash flow strategies that come in and around those spaces, some of the issues and challenges that you need to have a look at in that regard. So I can see a couple more jumped on. I can see Barb, Adam, Michael, and Daniel. How are you, Daniel? Welcome aboard, mate. Okay, today's session is footpaths, driveways, and crossovers. And while that may seem like a very boring topic, and I have to say that it actually is, there is a lot more to it than many people realize. And by the time we get to the end of this session, hopefully you're going to realize that it's not just that small piece of concrete that you drive past every single day, but there's actually quite a bit of, knowledge and challenges that you need to overcome when you're needing to install either a footpath, driveway, or a crossover. So let's start with a couple of little things. Oh, Michael says, hi, Rob. Thanks for the great meetup yesterday. You're welcome, Michael. Glad you enjoyed it, mate. I always love those sessions, whether it be Brisbane, Sydney, or Melbourne. And I especially love the social elements of it afterwards. So, yeah, spread the word, mate. That's all I can say. So we should start with a little bit of a definition. So firstly, we'll start with a crossover. What is a crossover? So the crossover is actually the part of the driveway that crosses from the footpath where the curb is, from the footway from the curb to the property boundary. So it's just the bit that basically traverses the nature strip itself. The driveway is then what extends from there onwards into your private property side of things. The footpath is clearly the paved area that's intended for pedestrians. So those three are fairly easy to come by from a definitions perspective. But who actually owns these elements? So the crossover is actually owned by council. The footpath is also owned by council, both of which I guess live in the nature strip, of which council actually owns. But the driveway actually belongs to the private property owner. Now, the ownership itself can actually be a little bit challenging if you're trying to do subdivisions, and you might have to have shared driveways and that sort of thing. And there are a number of different ways you can actually deal with that. Typically, the driveway is going to be owned by at least one person and potentially multiple. And then it's whether or not it's privately owned, whether it's shared via way of an easement, or whether or not it's got some form of community title that sits over that. So there's a couple of issues and challenges that may exist over that. But over and above those elements, there's actually a number of other components that you need to actually consider when you're thinking about your driveways and crossovers. So there's some elements and terminologies that you're going to come across. So the nature strip itself, that's clearly, the grassed area typically, or some place where the trees will actually exist. Then you've got the curb and gutter. So the curb and gutter is what is the interface between the nature strip and the road. It's typically designed in order to channel stormwater in and around or into stormwater gullies and the like. There is what is called the layback. So the layback is the transition from the road into the crossover itself, because sometimes there's a little bit of a height differential between the two. So the layback is that transition point, and quite often it's a slightly different angle to the rest of the crossover and or the rest of the driveway. There's also, I guess, the wings or skirting to the crossover itself, which are generally a slight ramp where they angle from the road surface or the layback surface and up to the curb and channel height. So they look like little wings on the side of the driveway, or sorry, of the crossover, I should say. Then you've got expansion joints within the concrete to make sure that the concrete doesn't actually get stressed and things like that. And then you've got some other elements where if you've got a footpath that's going to be intersecting with your crossover, the footpath might actually be at a different height to the crossover. So you're going to have some sort of transition ramp between those two. So they're really the elements that you're going to be dealing with it when you're trying to integrate some of the issues and challenges in navigating things in that process. I can see a few more people have jumped on, so I'll just say hi. So I can see Cameron, I can see Matt, I can see Marcus. So hello, everybody. Now, some of the challenges and the reasons why you'd be considering what you could or should be doing around your driveways is potentially you're doing some form of development approval, and council have come back to you with some DA approval conditions that may mandatorily mandate that you're actually going to resolve some of the existing issues and challenges that already exist. And even though it's actually the infrastructure is owned by council, because you've had the audacity to actually apply for a development application, they use that as their opportunity to upgrade their own existing infrastructure. So quite often, council can impose some conditions that may not necessarily on the surface of it appear to be fair and reasonable. However, council do that anyway. So one of those would be that if there are any existing damage or cracks in either the footpath, the driveway, or the curb and channel, then council is likely to mandate that you actually resolve that. And quite often, they will actually request you to install a footpath, even when one doesn't exist previously. And what that can create is a situation where the majority of the street has no footpath and your one little section has footpath. The intent there is that council's using their opportunity to have you subsidise or fund the construction of that footpath, and over time they'll get a number of people to be funding that as development approvals actually go through, and then they'll, I guess, come in and just join the gaps, so to speak, along the way. I can see Cherie said, hi, thanks for this. Appreciate your knowledge and sharing. No problems at all, Cherie. That's why we're here. We love to share the love. So no problem at all. Now, in considering how and where your driveway might go, there are a number of things that you need to consider with regards to potential obstructions and or impediments that may actually exist in and around the footpath area. So some of them being public utility services, street trees, water meters, traffic signs, parking meters, traffic islands, all sorts of things like that. So I'm going to go through each and every one of those one by one and let you know some of the issues and challenges that you're going to need to solve or be able to identify when trying to navigate or traverse around these things. So firstly, let's look at street trees. So the street tree is actually owned by council. It's actually a protected tree. And so anything that you want to do with regards to trimming it or removing that, you need to actually seek council approval in actually doing that. So before you go and install, if you're doing I guess a brand new townhouse or a subdivision or anything like that, and a tree is actually in the way, then part of your development application will be actually requesting council to assess the removal of that tree. And in doing so, council will come out, they'll have a look at the size of the tree, the species of the tree, whether or not it's what they call a tree of significance, and they'll make a determination as to whether or not that's a tree that they are willing to remove. And if they do remove that, then that will be at your expense. And then typically they would then mandate that you also additionally at your expense subsidize the installation of a new tree to replace that somewhere else in the community. So they don't just chop down trees and they're gone forever. They want to reinstate that somewhere else. So that's the first part of the process, is to actually go and seek council permission. What you may find when they navigate that, they'll have a look at the species and they may give you a couple of, they may say, no, we don't want to remove that tree. And instead you need to try and traverse or navigate around that. So when you try to do that, there's a thing called the root bowl, which is the size of the roots underneath the ground. And for every species of tree, it is slightly different. But effectively, if you look at the canopy of the tree, then typically the root bowl is going to be of an equivalent diameter underneath the ground. If you look up at the canopy and then look underneath, typically that's where the root bowl is going to be. So council will have some rules with regards to how close you can do anything in and around that root bowl. And you won't typically be allowed to actually put your crossover in that protected area. And there'll generally be a buffer that you need to put in between those. The next thing you might want to consider is potentially, is there a fire hydrant that you may be needing to either relocate, move sideways, or convert into a trafficable obstacle. Now, by trafficable, I mean you can actually drive over it. Now, in different jurisdictions, that is and isn't allowed. So I'm not going to say it's going to be allowed in every particular instance. You need to check with your particular utility provider, whoever's providing the water in the area, and say sometimes that's council, sometimes that's a private entity, sometimes that's a pseudo-government entity. But you need to engage with them to see whether or not the fire hydrant itself may need to be moved a little bit to the left or to the right, or alternatively, you may have to change the size, shape, and design of that, and depth of that, so that the crossover actually incorporates that into the crossover area. Next obstacle that you may need to try and avoid is a stormwater outlet. These are quite often called a curb adapter. So generally it's a little, and you may have seen, well, you're likely to have seen these everywhere, but not even realize that they're actually in existence. But effectively, the roof water from your house is typically allowed to, where gravity allows for it, shoot into the curb and gutter within the street. It will then go down the curb and gutter into the nearest stormwater pit. And in order for it to actually get onto that road network, it goes through a thing called a curb adapter, which is typically a round shape, and then it's in an adapter to make it blend into the shape of the curb and channel that you've actually got in place. So if you've got one of those curb adapters, typically they will not allow that within the crossover area, nor will they allow that within the wings of the driveway. And the wings are there so that when you're coming in, you need a little bit of turning circle to get onto the crossover. So the wings kind of capture that little element. So typically you're not allowed to have that stormwater outlet or curb adapter in and around that area. The next one would be the stormwater gully itself. So the actual where all of that goes. So it could be a manhole, it could be a gully. Quite often it's quite sizable in nature. If that is in the way of where you want your crossover to go or where you want your driveway to go, then you may have an opportunity to relocate that. But if you do, it's very, very expensive to do so. So you want to be really trying to find alternate ways of actually locating where that crossover actually goes to try and avoid that stormwater gully, because you could be anywhere from $30,000 to $80,000 in trying to relocate one of those, depending upon how and where they are, and they're not always able to be relocated. So it would be one of those things where if you can, you would certainly be trying to do whatever you can to actually relocate that. The next obstacle that you may come across is a bus stop. Now, again, a bus stop is one of those things where you're going to need council approval to relocate that. But not only do you need council approval to relocate that, but typically you need the neighbours' consent where that bus stop is going to be relocated to, for them to accept a bus stop onto their the front of their property. Now, generally, that's something that most neighbours aren't going to want to be accepting, considering that all of that traffic comes in front of your property. Why would they want that in front of their property? It doesn't seem to be a logical thing that most people would want to do. So if you are trying to convince a neighbour to do that, then almost certainly you're going to have to be convincing them with some form of bribery or liquid cash to try and convince them that it's actually worthwhile. The other element is not just the bus stop itself, but the bus needs a lead in order to get in there. So it needs room to actually maneuver in and room to maneuver out of that busway. So generally you can't park in and around the bus stops, and depending upon the different council, generally you're going to have somewhere between 10 and 15 metres worth of lead in up to the bus stop itself to actually allow for the bus to actually have that manoeuvring room to actually get in. So all of that will be a dead zone with regards to where you can put your crossover, and equally it'll be a dead zone with regards to where you can actually park on the street. Some other elements that you might want to be considering is, are there any street signs that are out the front of your property? Now, street sign is generally not that bad, but generally, depending upon the council jurisdiction, it's going to be somewhere between 0.5 metre and 1 metre away from the wings of the crossover as to where you can actually locate that. Street signs can, however, be one of those things that council will consider relocating. There is an application process to actually have that occur. It really depends on the nature of that sign, what that sign is actually there for, and whether or not that sign needs a certain amount of leading distance from the obstacle that it's actually alerting people towards. So there's some leniency there, but again, it's an application process to actually do that. Next one would be a lamp post or a power pole, or depending upon the state that you're in, they're sometimes called a Stobie pole. So these things are very, very difficult. They can be relocated, but you're going to be somewhere in the vicinity of $30,000 to, I'm going to say, $80,000 to move, depending upon what are the services that are actually connected to that pole, because it's generally not always just power. Quite often there's Telstra Alliance, there's Foxtel, there's a whole bunch of other services that sit in and around those things. So you want to really be trying to avoid that wherever possible and design in and around that rather than trying to go through where it's physically sitting. That said, I have seen instances where the only way to make a development site actually work was to actually relocate those, and so it was done in those particular instances. So I can see a couple of other people coming on board. So hi Dion, hi Serena, how are you? Some other obstacles and impediments that you might want to be considering is whether or not there's any street furniture. So street furniture is typically a council-owned asset. It could be a park bench, it could be a planter box, those sorts of assets, which it's really a beautification object in and around the area. Again, because it's a council-owned asset, then you're going to need council's approval to actually try and relocate those. Depending upon the intent of what that street beautification was, council, I guess, are typically going to be okay with relocating that, I guess, for a small distance, but that is definitely going to be at your expense. Next obstacle that you want to be considering would be things like traffic calming devices. So there might be a median strip or a traffic island or a speed bump to actually relocate. Now, those things are actually on the road network itself. So whether or not you can relocate that really comes down to who owns that portion of the road network. Because depending upon where you are, it may be a council-owned road, or it may be a state-controlled road through the main roads department or the relative main roads department in your state. And so it's not always that easy to actually relocate those devices. One, they're quite expensive to relocate. And two, it's a little bit of a bureaucratic nightmare to actually do that. So if you can try and avoid those, that is always highly encouraged. I can see Anastasia saying hi. So hi, Anastasia, how are you? and Alex has also joined, so welcome, Alex. Another thing to be considering is how and where you're going to be placing bins outside the front of your property, because you can't actually place the bin outside of the crossover or the driveway itself. So you need to actually have some curb and channel that physically belongs, is directly outside of your property. So it doesn't belong to you, but it's directly outside of your property for your bins to go. Now, in some instances, that can be quite challenging to achieve, especially where you're in a cul-de-sac, and just the mere turning circle requirement of that, and the fact that there are multiple driveways coming off that cul-de-sac, means there's not actually much curb and channel for you to place your bins out the front of your property. So you need to be considering the fact that you can actually relocate those, and you also may need to consider whether or not there is any street parking, particularly if there's things like yellow lines and that sort of thing in and of the surface. So I'm going to take a little sip, but just before I do, I'm going to encourage everybody to, I guess the whole point of these Facebook Lives is for you to actually ask questions as we go. There is always a delay between you typing it and me getting to see it on screen. So I encourage you to ask those questions early, and when they come through, I'll try to answer them as close to live as humanly possible. So one of the other obstacles that you may need to consider is how far you're actually away from an intersection or a corner. And that can be quite troublesome, depending upon whether or not you're on a minor road or a major road, and whether or not the road that you're on is intersecting with another minor road or another major road. If you consider that intersections are effectively two roads, one going one direction, one going the other, one could be minor, one could be major. And so depending upon how and where you're exiting, are you exiting on the minor road, or are you exiting onto the major road? The distance that you require from that corner can vary anywhere from 10 meters to 30 odd meters, depending upon what that intersection actually is, whether or not there's anything like a roundabout there, whether there's anything like traffic lights, those sorts of things. So there's always going to be some lead in and around those elements. So now each particular jurisdiction is going to have different rules as to what those lead-in distances are going to be. But I'm going to say if you're at a major road intersection, then chances are you're going to need, I'm going to say 20 meters is a fairly typical distance from that intersection for most councils. But it can be upwards of 30 depending upon how major that intersection actually is. The other element that you need to consider is, as you are able to exit your property, whether or not you've got sighting distances. So can you see clearly in one direction and the other for any oncoming traffic that is actually going to be coming? And you need to actually engage with a traffic engineer to actually determine whether or not you've actually got these sighting distances. But depending upon the nature of the road and the traffic speed of the road, so there's going to be a gazetted speed, could be 50 Ks, could be 60 Ks, could be 80 Ks an hour, depending upon what that is, then the distance that you need to be able to sight for needs to be ever increasing along the way. So basically the faster the speed, then the greater the distance that you need to be able to see that oncoming traffic coming, because the last thing that council wants you to do is either reverse out or drive out into oncoming traffic. So wherever that's likely to be an impediment, if you're in the back streets in a quiet little street, that's probably not such a big deal. But if you're coming into an arterial road or into a main artery, highway, major road, that sort of thing, then those sighting distances, you're probably going to need to engage with a traffic engineer to actually do those calculations for you. Another thing to consider, I guess that's all in and around what you're going to do for the crossover itself and how and where you're going to locate that. Obviously, you're going to have some constraints with regards to the property that you're trying to access. So where's the house going to be? Where's the car parking on the property itself? But you've got those other obstacles that you need to navigate around. So quite often you need to design around those obstacles, and you may not be able to do anything about that, which may then impact what you can actually do on the lot itself. So depending upon what you're doing on the lot, whether it be multi-unit dwellings, units or townhouses, or whether that be a subdivision, that may completely impact the design that you're actually going to be doing, and hence the yield of that. So I guess crossovers are a very underrated element in your process. Now I can see a question coming through. Adam says, "Hi Rob, in a splitter block situation, do you need to provide the new crossover driveway to the new lot to sell it? Or is that up to the buyer to pay for it, as they'd most likely want to choose where the crossover is placed?" So Adam, good question. It's actually, and before answering that, I'm going to, because the terminology splitter block is misunderstood in many instances. So I'm just going to clarify the definition there for some of our interstate people. So a splitter block is one title that has two lots on it already. And what you're going to do is then separate those two lots onto two individual titles. So that's an as of right to actually do that. Now that's completely different to a subdivision, which is one giant lot, which you then break into two lots, because the rules in and around those are completely different. So for a splitter block, because those two lots are already in existence, it is deemed to already comply in that you are allowed to have a crossover go in. Therefore, it is not mandatory that you install it, but rather it is then up to the incoming person to determine how and where they want to have put their house on the property. Do they want their driveway on the left? Do they want their driveway on the right? And because they have an as of right to install the driveway, if there are any obstacles in the way, like street trees and that sort of thing, they can apply to council, and council, I'm going to say, will generally be lenient, but in 99% of the times, they're going to have to mandatory allow that access through. It really depends on what the obstacle is that you're trying to remove. So if it's a bus stop or something like that, then that can get a little bit challenging. But equally, if it's a power pole, that's going to be a little bit costly. But it is not a mandatory element for you to supply, but it's typically one that the ultimate owner will actually determine how and where they would like. So hopefully that answers that question for you. I can see a few other people have joined. You're a little bit, we're about halfway through, folks. So I can see Jen and Noel have joined. So if you want to catch up on this, feel free to rewind later on. Now, I'm going to have I guess when we're looking at whether it be multi-unit dwellings or subdivisions, there's going to be some slightly different issues and challenges. So let's have a look at subdivision type processes, and in particularly where we're putting a rear lot in or a battle axe block in. And so you're needing to, I guess, traverse a long driveway to get to the rear of the property. So the biggest question that I actually get asked is, does the driveway count towards the lot size? And typically the answer is no, the driveway does not count towards the lot size in most councils. Now, some councils may consider it, but the bulk of them don't. So therefore, the size of the rear lot and the size of the front lot need to also then add on to the driveway itself. So when you're looking at, if I've got, and I'm just going to say Brisbane City Council, for example, you could have 400 metres for your front lot and you could have 600 metres for your rear lot. So if you've got 1,000 square metre property, you would mandatorily think, well, 1,000 square metres, I can do it. But because the driveway doesn't count, then you are technically short. Now, there's a couple of little loopholes that you can do to get around that. And that is that you could allow that driveway to be an easement on the front lot. So the front lot actually owns the driveway, but allows access to the rear lot. So that way you do have your 400 and 600, but the driveway is not, is a burden to the front lot and can actually impact the resale price of that. So that's something that you want to be very careful of. The next element that you want to consider is the length of that driveway. So the longer the distance to the rear of the property, then council will have some mandated elements as to how wide the driveway is going to be. And if you think about it logically, as you drive down a very long driveway, the chances of a car wanting to come the other way are relatively high. And so what council's trying to do is to say, well, for a fair and reasonable number of properties at the rear, then and a certain distance of driveway, we're going to mandate that the width of the driveway needs to be a certain width. So if I talk Brisbane City Council, for example, typically if it's up to 40 metres in length and less than 2 dwellings, then they'll allow 3.5 metres distance width on the driveway. But if there were 3 or 4 rear lots, then they're going to widen that to allow those things to, I guess, cars to pass both ways. Now, they may mandate the width of that, but if it's not physically possible, you may be able to get a performance solution with what they call a passing bay, which is a small little spot to park, which allows one person to go past, and then you pull out, and the passing bay typically is going to sit somewhere in and around the halfway mark on the driveway. If you're going to have a rear driveway, a driveway going to the rear lots as well, council will typically say that the driveway needs to be a fully formed driveway. So it can't be what is called car tracks. So it can't be one piece of concrete for one wheel and one piece of concrete for another wheel and a track. It needs to be a fully sealed driveway in that instance, okay? Now, who owns the driveway? Now, that is really going to come down to whether or not there was enough square meterage to actually allow that driveway to be owned by the rear lot. That's the ideal scenario. If it can't be done because there's not enough square meterage, then it may be owned by the front with an easement, as I said before, in favour of the rear property. Now that will impact the ownership of the front property, impact the valuation of the front property because it's got an easement that it is responsible for and burdened by the maintenance of. But it doesn't actually have any benefit to the process. I can see my daughter's jumped on. Hello, Amy. Hello, how are you, darling? So welcome aboard. Good to see you taking an interest in my work for a change. So who then maintains the driveway is the issue. So if there is an easement, if it's owned by one person and it's in favour of somebody else, then typically the maintenance of that actually belongs to the person who actually owns that driveway itself. And so it's one of those things where the person burdened by that doesn't really want to have that, hence the valuation drops. Now, the challenge there is if something happens to the driveway and the rear lot starts to complain, that can cause neighbour disputes and all sorts of things like that. So you want to try and avoid that wherever humanly possible, but sometimes it just physically can't be avoided. Now, in most instances, the neighbours are going to come to some fair and reasonable compromise in that regard, but just know that it can be quite challenging well past the date that you've actually sold it. If you're having a long driveway as well, then you need to consider that the driveway itself is the most logical spot to put underground services. So where you're going to put electricity to access the rear lot, where you're going to put your telecommunications, water, sewer, stormwater, that sort of thing is likely to go down that driveway section. Reason for that is it's much easier to pull up and maintain at some point in the future, especially if it is traversing somebody else's lot by way of an easement. So that's one of the things to consider. Now, designs. Now, you may not have actually thought about this, but there are actually multiple crossover designs that actually sit out there. So there's a couple of terminologies that I'm going to throw out there. So one is called an invert crossing. And now I'm actually going to read the definition of this out because my ability to articulate this is probably not going to be as clear. But it's a cutout of the curb in order to ensure greater access to the property. And the height of the invert entry point depends on the type of curb and channel outside of the property. Now, what that really means is the curb and channel is going to be at one height, and then it just dips down and becomes one solid surface. So it looks like the curb and channel just blends down and then keeps on going and then blends back up, going up the other side. So that's an invert crossing. That's different to the next type, which is called a grid crossing. Now, a grid crossing is typically the curb and channel is going to be full height the whole way. And then there's going to be a little bit of a ramp that sits in front of the curb and channel. And when you look at it sideways, So if I've got the ramp just before, if I turn it sideways, you'll see that there's actually a gap, which actually allows water, leaves, debris, that sort of thing to actually go down the curb and channel. So it's a little bit of a ramp up in order to effectively jump the curb and channel. So that's called a grid crossing. And then a swale is the last one, and a swale is effectively where there's likely to be a large amount of stormwater or overland flow. Then a swale, and it's typically going to come because of the fact that the property with the driveway and the crossover actually has a fair amount of gradient. So it's actually going to be water coming with pace. So a swale actually just blends nicely. So it's almost like a gradient that blends straight into the road surface. And it allows the water to then come out and not come out in a torrent, so to speak. So those three designs are typically what you're going to come across. So the invert crossing, the grid crossing, and the swale. Okay, those three. Now, not every single council will accept all three designs, and it's going to be very subjective to how and where you physically are as to whether or not that council does accept that. Now, when you go out into the more rural and regional areas, those crossovers are going to change somewhat, because they may not necessarily have a curb and channel type system out there. Instead, they may have little gullies on the side of the road to capture your stormwater. So there's going to be things like a box culvert, which is a box that sits over the culvert section and effectively forms a mini bridge that actually allows you to cross that little culvert. So that's the other thing to consider when you're out in and around rural areas when you're doing subdivisions. Now, when you're actually going to be doing your construction of your crossovers, generally council will have what is called standard drawings, and the standard drawings will be engineered designs that will have all of the different widths, depths, concrete material, what you need to put in there from a strengthening perspective, what the materials are going to be, all of those sorts of things. They'll actually mandate what they are going to be. And depending upon what it is that you're accessing and how many vehicles are going to be trafficking it, they will have multiple versions of those standard drawings. So a standard crossover for a single dwelling may be different to going into a multi-res, which may be different to going into an industrial area, for example. So they'll have multiple versions of those standard drawings. So make sure that you refer to your local council for those standard drawings in order to determine that. Now, those standard drawings are going to have some common elements that are typically going to be there. So they'll determine the materials that you're actually allowed to construct this out of. So some of those materials would be concrete itself. Now, typically that's going to be what they call a broom finish. So it's a non-slip surface, okay? You could potentially do asphalt, although asphalt crossovers are typically only going to exist in and around the rural areas. And you may be allowed clay pavers and or concrete pavers in some councils, but not all councils. Now, typically what will not be allowed will be tiles, loose stones, gravel, and those sorts of things. Because they're generally pedestrian hazards with regards to slips or trip hazards and that sort of thing. So it's going to be some sort of material that is a non-slip finish and fits council standards. The other element to that, those standard drawings, is they will mandate the width of the crossover, they'll mandate the angle of the wings, and they'll also mandate the gradient that the crossover must be. So if you've got a fairly steep property that you're trying to access, the crossover element will be standard, but then, so you may have a low gradient at the crossover, and then it may have to jump up quite significantly once it actually gets onto the property. So that can be quite challenging in some instances. So you may have to have some form of transition to actually allow vehicles to do that without actually bottoming out if that invert level is too large. Now, as I said, some of those lengths and widths, every single council is going to have different dimensions on these, but the number of the number of dwellings that are actually going to be accessed will mandate some of these elements, and also the length of the driveway itself will also mandate it. So if I talk to Brisbane City Council, for example, if it's 1 to 3 dwellings and less than 40 metres of distance the driveway, then the driveway itself is allowed to be 3.5 meters wide. If there are 4 to 5 dwellings, though, then that needs to go out to 4 meters wide, and if it's greater than 6, then it's going to be 6.5 meters wide. Okay. If the driveway distance is longer than 40 meters, though, then that's where things change significantly. So if it's longer than 40 meters, then they'll instantly mandate that it goes to that 6 meter and even potentially wider again if there's more dwellings at the back. Now, every council, as I said, is going to have different distances on those. So I encourage you to have a look at those distances for yourselves. Now, I'm coming close to some of the end of some of the content. I encourage some questions, guys, and there is a lag in this process. So please ask your questions now so that by the time I get to the end of the content, I've actually got some time to answer your questions. If you have got a steep lot, I did touch on steep lots before, the angle of attack that you're actually going to be coming in for your driveways and crossovers, most councils will have a ratio on this. Now, it's going to vary across each particular council, but I'm going to say that the desirable would be what they call a 1 in 6. So for every 1 meter in height that you're going up, you need at least 6 meters to transition that height to actually occur. So that's a 1 in 6 is what most councils are desiring as the maximum. However, there will be some councils that will actually accept a 1 into 4. Okay, so 1 meter height over a 4 meter distance. Now that's actually quite a steep angle when you're actually trying to drive it. So not so much when you're going in a forward direction, but if you have to reverse down that, it can actually be quite tricky and troublesome. Even in the dry and in the daylight. But if you can imagine trying to reverse down one of those driveways at night and in the rain, then that can be, I guess, very hazardous, quite potentially. The other element that they will actually care about is, depending upon the number of dwellings that you've actually got, have you got a safe location that you can actually store your bins? And this is more particular if you're in a multi-res type situation, so units, townhouses, and the like. And they're going to say that for the storage of your bins, one, it's going to have to be in a bin enclosure, but two, that bin enclosure needs to have a much lower gradient on it. And typically that's going to be a 1 in 20 gradient for those bins because they don't want the bin itself to roll down the hill. Now, particularly where you've got bulk storage bins, effectively they might be put away in those storage areas and they're pulled out on rubbish day. The bin guy comes by and picks those up, and when they're pulled out, the council doesn't want them to roll down and land in the street. So that's one of the issues and challenges there. From a multi-lot consideration, one of the things that you'll need to consider is turning circles in and around the property itself. So can you traverse onto the property, do a 3-point turn and traverse off the property all in a forward facing direction? Council is going to very much care that that actually is possible in your driveway situation. They're also going to care about whether or not you've got enough parking, and there's generally going to be some rules about how much parking is required depending upon the number of bedrooms and the number of dwellings in there. There'll be a formula or a calculation that will determine how many car parks are required for the residents and how many car parks are actually required for the visitors. So make sure that all of those are actually catered for. And as I said, being able to enter and exit in a forward-facing direction is quite important for that. On those multi-res, the refuse collection that I did touch on before becomes even more important now because the likelihood of you requiring, I guess, the larger bin enclosures becomes quite high. The likelihood of a truck needing to actually get onto the property and then reverse off of the property becomes quite high as well. So you need to make considerations for those things, especially where you've got trucks are quite high. So you're going to make sure that there's some clearance certificates for those on the way. Now I can see a question here from Michael, so I'll just go straight to that. So when a curb adapter is in the way of a crossover, can you do the work yourself if licensed to do so? Does the council require you to complete a DA for it? And do they need to witness it? Also, can you go back to the boundary and relocate across and out again onto the acceptable distance from the proposed crossover? I'm not quite sure I understand the second part to that. I'm just going to reread that. Can you just go back to the boundary and relocate across and out again to an acceptable distance from the proposed crossover? Okay, I think I understand that. So let me rephrase that just so that, just for my clarification, so hopefully I'm answering the right question. So the curb adapter, which for everybody else's benefit who came on late, curb adapter is where the stormwater from the dwelling, I guess, jettisons water out into the street. It has to be, I guess, shaped in order to actually fit into the curb and channel. You can't have that sitting within the crossover itself, nor can you have that sitting within the wings. And generally, council will actually want a distance from the wings, and each council could be anywhere from 30 centimetres to, say, a metre from those wings in order to do that. Now, the answer is, can you do it yourself? So long as the standard drawings, so those standard documents that I mentioned before are met, you'll need to provide evidence of those. You'll likely need to put an application to council, and it's going to be a minor application in this instance, just a permit to say, look, I'm doing these works, I'm going to be applying these standard drawings, here's the before, after, and here's the after photos. You provide those, provide the evidence of what was actually installed, and generally you could do that yourself. That said, I would highly encourage you to actually engage with, I guess, a professional concreting outfit. Firstly, the liability, you don't want to have that liability if council deem something to be non-compliant. If you've done something and it becomes a trip hazard or anything like that, you certainly don't want to get involved in that. But the answer is yes, you can, so long as you do the appropriate permits. Now, that's going to obviously be subjective to every council, but in the bulk of it, yes, you can. And the second part of your question, can you relocate the curb and channel adapter? Yes, you could. You could relocate that, but the thing that you'll need to consider in doing that is that you'll need to patch up the old hole for the curb and channel. You can't just leave the old hole in place, if that makes sense. So hopefully that's answered that question for you. Okay, and I'm just coming, I guess, into the closing stages of this. So any questions that you guys have got, I highly encourage to be putting them out there right now. So some other considerations that you might want to be thinking about, okay? So if you need to construct a driveway prior to constructing any dwellings, so for example, you've done a subdivision and then you're going to construct a home at the back of that, or maybe you've done a staging for your townhouses, so you've subdivided and then you're going to build some townhouses later on. Council may mandate that the driveway and the curb and channel go in up front in order to get the subdivision element approved. The challenge there is that when you go to then construct, you're going to have a bunch of heavy vehicles, whether they be cement trucks, whether they be delivery trucks, that sort of thing, traversing that driveway, and quite likely they're actually going to be damaging the driveway. So there's a couple of different ways you can actually deal with that. One is you could over-engineer the driveway up front and make sure it can actually deal with the additional weight of all of those elements. Or alternatively, you might go the other way and you might make it as lightweight as humanly possible to actually pass, knowing that it's going to be a sacrificial driveway. So you're minimizing your costs. You know that it's going to crack, you know that it's going to get damaged. Later on, you're going to tear it up and reinstate that with a brand new driveway that's not going to deal with that. And what you might do there, for example, if you're doing a townhouse project, you want to have a nice look and feel on your driveway. You might want to put, say, an exposed aggregate type finish on your finished driveway, but there's no point putting that exposed aggregate in up front because you know that the trucks are going to damage it. So you might go for a basic standard broom finish on day one, and you do the very minimum standard depth and the very minimum standard strength. You know that it's going to get damaged, then you would tear that up and then replace that with a brand new exposed aggregate later on. So that's the kind of thing that you could do. Or alternatively, you could put the exposed aggregate day one and just over-engineer that to be able to bear the additional weight, but that won't necessarily stop scrapes and scuffs and that sort of thing along the way. So you're going to be on tenterhooks during the entire construct period. So make sure you budget for the potential for 2 driveways to be installed. One is a sacrificial one, one is the final one. Can see Michael said thank you, so that's good. The other thing is that council may mandate certain conditions on your DA approvals, and this is the one that catches a lot of people out and they don't actually budget for it, and that is if they mandate the installation of a footpath where it doesn't exist before. So you may look down your street and you go, there's no footpath here, council are not going to mandate that actually goes in, and lo and behold, when it comes down to it, council do. So you want to be very, very mindful of those. And I guess final element to be considering is before you're going to be doing any construction in the either the crossover or the driveway itself, make sure you do a dial before you dig. Make sure you actually understand what all of your underground services are. Make sure that you've got the appropriate standards, design documents in place, that you're actually got someone who knows how to construct to those standards, that you get the appropriate permits and approvals. And in particular, you're going to require the owner's consent. So if you don't yet own the property, make sure you've got a signed owner's consent to actually make that happen. Make sure you've checked all of your distances from your trees, your street Cs, your bus stops, your stormwater gullies, your power poles, all of those sorts of things. Make sure you've checked all of those distances. Every single council will have a slight different distance calculation for each of those obstacles. So make sure that you've, at least as part of your due diligence, captured all of those. Then you can go to your council records and actually determine whether or not you can do that. Your driveway itself and even the crossover, it's going to have to be a non-slip surface and load bearing. So you generally have a number of different surfaces that you could choose. Some of that's going to come down to the look and feel that you want for the end, and some of that's going to come down to cost. So you've got a range of construction materials that council will typically accept. So just be mindful of the fact, are they going to be doing any construction at the tail end, and do I need to have that sacrificial one along the way? And lastly, make sure you take photo evidence both before and after. So one of the council mandates when you get a DA approval will be repair any existing damage. So you need to take photo evidence of the first saying, here is the damage, and a photo evidence of the after saying, here it is fixed, in order to get your, I guess, your final approvals when it comes to plan sealing and the like. So hopefully that helps. So just checking to see any last questions. So Matt Leonard has said, lots of great info. Thanks, Rob. You're welcome, mate. And Derek has joined right at the bell, so he's jumped on board just as we're signing off. So hi, Derek, and bye, Derek. Make sure you rewind and watch the whole lot, mate. Last questions, folks. While I'm waiting for these to come in, I will do a little bit of what's coming up in and around Property Developer Network. So the next meeting that we've got is actually in Melbourne, and that is on the 1st, so that's next Saturday. We've got a gentleman by the name of Mark Baker going to be talking about positive cash flow properties, so rent per room type strategies, some of the opportunities, some of the legislative requirements, what you can and can't do in and around those areas. And we've also got Ray Liu talking about a real deal, so sharing his tale of good, bad and indifferent on his project where he did a 3 townhouse project there in Melbourne. So that's what's coming up in Melbourne next week. So as I can't see any more questions coming on, guys, and we're approaching the hour-long mark, I'm going to say that that's probably a wrap for today. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate what it is. If you want to know anything more about whether it be this or about anything in and around the property development process, if you're wanting to learn the process, feel free to reach out and we would be more than happy to point you in the right direction as to some of our services that we can actually offer to resolve that. So until then, folks, I'm hoping to see you at our next meetup, and bye for now. Bye.